China today has a GDP around $14 trillion by nominal exchange rates, around $27 trillion by purchasing power parity, which makes it the second largest economy in the world by the nominal rates and the largest by purchasing power. The US GDP, by contrast, is around 21 trillion. These are, of course, pre-coronavirus related economic figures, so they are certainly subject to some pretty rapid changes in the immediate future, but that's sort of where it stands GDP-wise. So it is this increasingly large and significant economic power. It has attained some greater diplomatic weight and some greater weight at institutions like the IMF, which added the Chinese currency to part of its basket of currencies, for example, but still really remains a secondary or tertiary figure in a lot of those. And it has developed some increased military power, but it's nowhere near the extent of actively using it around the world that a lot of other powers are yet. And one important thing to look at is sort of turning back to the Belt and Road Initiative. As I discussed, a lot of these areas where China was able to make major investments were regions that were not heavily invested in before. And as it turns out, there tends to be a reason for that. China basically had to, in order to get a foot in the game, invest in regions that were either less profitable or subject to more external risks, or both. And you've started to see a lot of crises developing in countries along the Belt and Road Initiative. So in Pakistan, for instance, you had a major IMF bailout last year, which was followed by extensive austerity cuts, including heavy cuts to spending on Belt and Road Initiative projects. A lot of Chinese investments in Pakistan were actually designed sort of in advance with the understanding that there might be some form of default, and so they built in safeguards like allowing the energy company that they invested heavily in to, if the government stopped paying it, to basically pass on those additional costs directly to consumers, and to exempt itself from being able to be taxed as a means to raise revenue to deal with the debt crisis. In Sri Lanka, you had this sort of extraordinary example of the port of Hambantota being seized by China, or I should say being, it's probably a bit dramatic way to phrase it. It was a 99-year lease on the port was given over to China as a debt relief measure in exchange for the waiving of a lot of Chinese debt that had been taken out in the construction of this port. And I particularly wanted to correct my phrasing there, because this is the way in which this has been perceived by or talked about by a lot of commentators, and particularly, US media commentators, is seeing this as this was a debt trap that China incited Sri Lanka to take on this debt with the intent of seizing this port. And I think that actually sort of misses the actual point here. Firstly, Sri Lanka's debt crisis is much broader and more extensive than just the Chinese loans it took out. And I think what this actually reflected is that a lot of the projects in Sri Lanka that China has been investing in are turning out right now to not be profitable, including this port and also a major international airport it constructed in the center of Sri Lanka. And so this 99-year lease, it offers China something in return for its investment there, but owning that port doesn't mean much unless there can actually be significant use of that port. And so I think a lot of the most ambitious ideas of Chinese capitalists in constructing and investing in the Belt and Road Initiative was that this would really create a restructuring of some global trade flows, and that you would actually build some new major economic routes across Central Asia and through the maritime path as well. So far, it really doesn't seem like that's panned out. Obviously, this is a project that's planned to go through 2049, so that could very well change, but it is a serious concern for China that because it's had to invest in all these regions that were less profitable or more risky politically or militarily, even in some cases, it's going to see a larger rate of failures on its investments. And that's sort of the cost of having to play second fiddle and go to all the regions that are less heavily invested into. So for some other examples, in the Maldives, an island chain around here, there was a major debt crisis as well, and they're seeking the serious forgiveness of a lot of the debt that was incurred by a previous government to China there. In Malaysia, there's also been a major cutback in investments into Belt and Road Initiative projects, and one of the major projects had been this sort of port in Western Malaysia. It doesn't show up all that well in this background, unfortunately, but right now, almost all of China's naval shipment of oil from Africa and from the Middle East goes right past Singapore through the Malacca Straits, and that's sort of a vulnerability that China's been working to address, both through a pipeline through Myanmar here, and also through a port in Western Malaysia that would allow it to bypass that. And that project has sort of just, the Malacca Gateway, it's sort of just been a large zone of empty land for now because it hasn't been economically viable to continue. In Kazakhstan, you've seen extensive construction of rail infrastructure to connect China and Europe. And what you've seen is, first of all, because China in most cases has a pretty large trade surplus with Europe, you often had cars with cargo going from China but not having anything to bring back. And then also you had companies sort of exploiting the state subsidies that were given for this line to just ship empty train cars across the continent to receive subsidies. And these are a lot of the pitfalls that Chinese capital is running into because of its need to go to these sort of external, these sort of less established areas in order to seek investments there, rather than having the ability to just straight up compete in all of the markets it might want access to. Although, of course, it is seeking to expand its access to those as time has gone on. And so there's also been a major reaction to the development of China as a major power, as a lot of other powers sort of belatedly realized that, hey, there's a new contender on the world stage we have to interact with here. You see this in terms of increasing disputes around the South China Sea, both U.S. naval and in some cases like the French Navy deploying there to contest Chinese control of a lot